Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome everyone, good afternoon. This is our first Friday, September webinar, The Criminalization of Women's Health in El Salvador, 2 Case Studies in Health and Human Rights. My name is Rob Murphy. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Health and Director of the Center for Communicable Diseases. I'm also the John Philip Fair Professor of Infectious Diseases and Professor of Biomedical Engineering here at Northwestern. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Please take a moment to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. In addition, we welcome you to become a member of the Institute for Global Health if you're a faculty member already. And this will help us, and we can provide you with all sorts of resources and services that support research infrastructure. And you can do this at our website, which is globalhealth.northwestern.edu/members. Today, we're really happy to have with us Professor Juliet Sorensen and Alexandra Tarzikhan, who will be presenting reports on the health and human rights trial issues of 2 women in El Salvador. Juliet Sorensen is a clinical professor at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law, where she is associated with the Center for International Human Rights. Professor Sorensen is the founder and director of the Northwestern Access to Health Project, an interdisciplinary global community-based partnership at the intersection of health, human rights, and development. Alexandra Tarzikhan is the Schuette Clinical Fellow in Health and Human Rights at the Center for International Human Rights at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law. Alex has a dual degree in law and a master's in public health from Northwestern University School of Law and Tufts University School of Medicine in Boston. Her interests lie in the fields of human rights, global health, and migration. Through this fellowship, Alex has been able to support health and human rights projects in Nigeria, Botswana, Lebanon, Ghana, and Greece. And she has also worked in refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Greece. And finally, there'll be time at the end for questions following both presentations, in which you're able to submit your questions through the chat feature directly to questions at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And we will take the questions right out of the chat, and I'll be asking the questions to the speakers. And so I leave it up to our speakers. Take it away, Juliet.
Great, thank you so much, Rob, for the kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And it looks like I've successfully done so. So thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and to take this hour to talk with you all and my colleague Alex about these 2 extraordinary case studies related to, what I call criminalization and indeed weaponization of women's health in El Salvador, and how they are implicated from a health and human rights perspective or lens. So I'm going to start by way of background. Oh, sorry, hold on, my screen froze. There we go. Okay, Trial Watch may be better known by the name of the organization that founded it. It's the Clooney Foundation for Justice, and of course that would be George and Amal Clooney. It was launched with some fanfare in April 2019, and its aim is to monitor and grade, evaluate, analyze, and grade the fairness of criminal trials of vulnerable groups around the world. You can see the vulnerable groups that Trial Watch has identified. They also strategically identify geographic areas where these significant human rights and trial-related rights are at great risk. The methodology is quite simple. Trial Watch identifies and recruits in-country monitors. They're local monitors who are both from the region, speak the language that the trial is taking place in, and then receive training in the basics of trial monitoring. Trial Watch has also developed an app which also received some attention when it was first developed because it's an ability essentially to memorialize in real time human rights violations that observers are taking in on the ground. Variations of the Trial Watch app have also been used by both human rights observers, monitors, and journalists in conflict zones and in other situations where the human rights violation can occur in an instant and it is difficult thereafter to document and memorialize. Trial Watch's analysis includes the application of a so-called global justice ranking system that measures courts' compliance with international human rights standards. And the purpose of this, of course, ultimately at the end of the day is advocacy. Advocacy in both at the local, the national, and the international level, specifically related to the human rights that are at risk. So just another minute on the methodology used by Trial Watch. As I said before, those local trial monitors are recruited and trained. I would say just over a year ago, last summer, I was asked by Trial Watch if I would be willing to serve as an expert and be on their roster of experts to provide analysis of trials that they had monitored, specifically in the area of health and human rights. As you can see from step 3, I was given the record in the case, which includes both court filings and the notes and data gathered by the trial monitors and observers. In this case, of course, all of that was in Spanish. I myself am a Spanish speaker and Alex is a native speaker. So lucky for me, I had my secret weapon and my colleague. Step 4 is the fairness report, and we'll describe our analysis and our findings in the report. And again, step 5 is ultimately advocacy. And I'm going to speak a bit more at the end of the presentation about the different forms of international human rights advocacy and the impact that it can have, and also some of the challenges and shortcomings in that way.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining. It's great to virtually be with you all today. To provide more background on the cases, we analyzed the criminal proceedings against 2 defendants, in this case, Evelyn Hernandez and Diana. Diana was given a fictitious name in order to protect her anonymity. At the time, Evelyn was 18 years old and Diana was 31, and both women were from an impoverished indigent community in El Salvador. So both women were arrested while seeking medical treatment following apparent stillbirths that occurred while they were at home. Evelyn had experienced severe abdominal pain and diarrhea. She sought relief in a latrine and ultimately delivered a child. Evelyn stated that she was impregnated as a result of a sexual assault and was unaware of her condition, instead mistaking her symptoms for stomach troubles. Evelyn's mother found her unconscious and covered in blood, and she was rushed to the hospital for emergency medical care. In Diana's case, she gave birth at home, unassisted. The child did not survive, and Diana experienced medical complications as well. She was transported to a public hospital where she underwent emergency medical procedures. And these were the facts that had been presented to us in the record. So both women were brought to the attention of the police by the healthcare professionals that attended to their care, and they were arrested and handcuffed to their hospital bed. Despite the dearth of evidence, both were subsequently charged with aggravated homicide, and transferred to prison to await their trial. And in Evelyn's case, she was initially sentenced to 30 years in prison. So next slide, please. So there were many human rights violations that occurred in these 2 cases. First, both Evelyn and Diana were subjected to unjustified pretrial detention. There was no justification for keeping them in detention, and the reasons for keeping a defendant in pretrial detention in these 2 cases did not apply. A number of Diana's rights were violated throughout the proceedings, including her right to humane treatment. Diana had been suffering from psychological issues, including delusions and disordered thinking, and even tried to attempt suicide while she was detained. And Diana was also repeatedly subjected to maltreatment. Among other things, she was handcuffed just after giving birth, and this practice has been considered by various international bodies to constitute cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. And the authorities also failed to provide Diana with the specialized psychological care that she required, causing significant suffering, and the denial of this adequate medical care in detention also violated her right to humane treatment. In Evelyn's case, the right of the presumption of innocence was violated. This is where the legal burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove that the accused is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And if reasonable doubt remains, then the accused has to be acquitted, which ultimately Evelyn was, but she still remained in prison for a very, very long time before she was released. And even though Evelyn was acquitted and the charges against Diana were dismissed, the case against these women were flawed from the start due to the insufficiency of the evidence that was found against them. Both women were victims of the discriminatory application of El Salvador's criminal laws to women, especially poor women, who seek needed medical care for pregnancy complications. Stereotypes infected the legal proceedings throughout, leading the authorities to presume guilt and neglect alternate lines of inquiry. The prosecution in Evelyn's case, for example, ignored evidence that the cause of the child's death and her incapacity at the time of birth, instead insinuating that a good mother would have saved her baby. The prosecution further inferred homicidal intent from Evelyn's alleged concealment of her pregnancy, again, in the face of contradictory evidence. And this conduct constituted gender-based discrimination. And more broadly, it is marginalized women who bear the brunt of El Salvador's policy of prosecuting impoverished women for pregnancy complications beyond their control. And this policy, in effect, if not by design, is discriminatory on the basis of gender and class. And I'll turn it back to Juliet to speak more about the broader human rights and reproductive health implications of these two cases.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I wanted to follow up on a couple of the bullets. Because of my screen sharing, I can't suss out if there are any lawyers in our audience today, but let me just say, with regard to the international human rights standards for a fair trial, they're highly similar. The variations are really only semantic to the standards that we utilize in the United States that are in the Bill of Rights and in subsequent legislation. So with regard to pretrial detention, international human rights standards ask that pretrial detention be the minimal conditions necessary to assure continued appearance at court hearings, and to ensure that there is not flight by the accused, or, depending on the nature of the offense, danger of to the community. The right to the presumption of innocence is equally critical under international human rights law as it is here in the United States. And in Evelyn's case, in her first trial, the prosecutor repeatedly, what we would call burden shifted, pointed to the defense for failing to prove that Evelyn had not killed her newborn immediately after giving birth. As any logician knows, it's extremely difficult to prove a negative, and by the prosecutor impermissibly burden shifting, it put the defense in a nearly impossible situation. Indeed, the charge against Evelyn on retrial was an impermissible example of burden shifting, in that instance sanctioned by El Salvadoran law. She was charged with homicide by omission. In other words, homicide by failing to save the life of her child. Bear in mind that the quantum of evidence, which as Alex described was very weak, had not changed at all from one trial to the next. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back right now, and I'm going to talk a bit about broader human rights and reproductive health implications in El Salvador. We're essentially looking at 3 criminal laws in El Salvador that have bearing on both a climate of legitimized gender-based violence and indeed a profound chilling effect on reproductive freedoms and choices of women. So the first law, as you see there, is a total ban on abortion. Abortion is a criminal offense. And to be clear, it is a criminal offense by, number 1, the woman, and number 2, the medical professional who conducts the abortion. So those are the first 2. The third law that directly relates to this is essentially what we would call in the United States a law that criminalizes aiding and abetting, facilitating, helping somebody to get an abortion. And so what is the result? Well, the result, of course, is that women don't seek needed medical treatment, and they are disinclined even to not only to seek an abortion in whatever the circumstances, but they're ultimately disinclined even to give birth in a healthcare facility, particularly in public health, in public hospitals. So according to the WHO, the abortion ban in El Salvador is estimated to be the second cause of second highest cause of maternal mortality, and the third cause of mortality among adolescent girls. Suicide accounts for 57% of the deaths of pregnant females who are adolescents. Suicide is also the third most common cause of maternal mortality in El Salvador. So again, stepping back from these specific cases, as Alex alluded to earlier, we see selective enforcement of the abortion and other reproductive health laws in El Salvador. Women who cannot afford a private healthcare provider or a private healthcare facility. These laws appear to be selectively enforced to send a message to take advantage against poor women, marginalized women, women who not only cannot afford a private healthcare provider, but also cannot afford private legal counsel, which was the case here. And so the result is that over the past 20 years, El Salvadorian courts have convicted and imprisoned dozens of women for up to 40 years because they had an abortion or simply suffered a miscarriage, again, with the majority being marginalized. The climate for healthcare professionals is it's unethical from one perspective, and certainly when it comes to a healthcare professional's obligations to caring for a patient. Healthcare professionals are now incentivized to report patients to the police because they themselves fear criminal repercussions if they do not. The incentive to avoid seeking medical attention for pregnancy, of course, potentially results in significant maternal and child health consequences. And if you look at the health indicators for El Salvador, you know that among the Americas, they are some of the lowest. Alex, over to you.
And just to add quickly on what Juliet said, so the complete ban on abortion in the country also means that no exceptions are granted. And it also affects the patient-provider relationship because there are even certain cases where if a pregnant woman has cancer, before administering chemotherapy, the life of the fetus is accounted for when determining the dose of how much chemotherapy to administer to the woman. And same goes with ectopic pregnancies. They have to be really careful with ensuring that the fetus isn't affected when those two complications occur. So obviously there are grave consequences both for the right to privacy and also it also obviously affects medical ethics and the patient-provider relationship as well. So then moving along to the recommendations for policy and reform, we believe that El Salvador should reform its laws to comply with international human rights norms and respect the rights of women. Specifically, it should ensure that decision-making in cases involving alleged abortion or alleged aggravated homicide is free of gender stereotypes, particularly with respect to intent and alternate explanations of cause of death. How to do this? So this could be done by creating a task force within the Attorney General's office that is dedicated to evaluating such cases. And then charges should be subjected to the approval of this kind of task force before they're taken on. El Salvador should also ensure that detention measures comply with the right to be free from cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, particularly with respect to the handcuffing of pregnant women and the provision of necessary medical assistance while in detention. And health professionals should be allowed to treat patients who have undergone obstetric emergency without fear of state reprisal. As well, it should, I think, yeah, next slide, I believe. As well, in order for El Salvador to meet its obligations under the InterAmerican Convention and the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, El Salvador must revise its legislation and policies to ensure that health professionals are not compelled to report women for poor pregnancy outcomes. And it should also review its legislation and policies to ensure that all women and girls, especially those who are impoverished and who live in rural communities, have equal access to comprehensive and confidential healthcare, as well as quality sexual and reproductive health education.
Okay, so as I said at the start of our discussion, the Clooney Foundation Trial Watch Initiative doesn't seek these reports in a vacuum. They seek them with an advocacy purpose and indeed to positively impact these regions in which the human rights violations that they document in particular trials are at grave risk. International human rights advocacy, frankly, has its limitations, and it has its limitations in a couple of ways. One, from the perspective of a practicing lawyer, and you know, in the legal clinic, we teach our students to take a client-centered approach, a community-centered approach, not unlike the patient-centered approach that medical professionals take. There are times that international human rights legal instruments move so slowly and the cases seem so abstract that human-centered approach is lacking for the advocates. Nonetheless, the upside to advocating with regard to these issues at an international level is not only the international attention they receive, but the potential for a binding judgment from an international tribunal. And since we're in the United States with a US audience, I always have to add, for countries that tend to pay more attention to international tribunals and their binding judgments than the United States. So let me get back to the cases of Evelyn and Diana first. These truly sad cases both had happy endings. It's the view of Trial Watch and their implementing partner, the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights, that the outcomes were very likely the result of international scrutiny, including the monitoring by the Trial Watch monitors. So with regard to Diana, as Alex described to you, her case was actually dismissed by the judge. At the second pretrial hearing, the judge concluded that there was no probable cause to proceed with the offense of aggravated homicide against the newborn. Those charges were dismissed. A Trial Watch monitor was present from the inception. With regard to Evelyn, it was a much longer road to hoe. I described this process at the outset. She was convicted, she was appealed, and at this point, her case began to get both international attention from human rights organizations and also significant press coverage, as well as local activism and advocacy. The case was remanded for retrial, and it was approximately a year ago, right before Alex and I began working on Evelyn's report, that after the retrial, the trial judge decided to vacate the conviction of Evelyn. So we wrote and published the report in the time period in which the prosecution was considering whether or not to appeal. Our partners with us in El Salvador shared the Spanish language version of the report. It received significant press coverage there, and ultimately the prosecution decided not to appeal, and that would be the second appeal, Evelyn's case. So as I said, sad cases, but at least these individual cases on an individual level had a happy ending. I mentioned the press coverage. Evelyn's case was covered by the BBC, The Guardian, and the New York Times, and that was in significant thanks to local organizations such as it's called Agrupación para la Despenalización del Aborto, so a local women's advocacy group that advocates for reproductive rights, and also the Center for Reproductive Rights, which you may know, headquartered in New York, but with a significant presence in Latin America. So the question becomes, what next? Is it possible to leverage the outcomes in these cases and have a broader impact on reproductive health and women's health and human rights in the region? And indeed beyond, because as we all know, neither international law nor the weaponization of reproductive rights and women's health is limited to one part of the world. So there has been some follow-on advocacy. The Clooney Foundation for Justice and Trial Watch is partnering with an NGO called Women's Link in preparing a petition to file before the Constitutional Court of Rwanda to address a law that is eerily similar, both on its face and in its application, but with a couple of key differences. The law in Rwanda specifically criminalizes infanticide, but wait, there's more. It's not simply, as the word might imply, the killing of an infant. It is very specifically the killing of by a mother of her newborn child. Now, you would think that this is encompassed in general homicide laws. It is. Indeed, Women's Link advocates that the law be repealed in its entirety. But this law, like the abortion law in El Salvador, is also discriminatory in its application. The women who are charged with infanticide tend to be among the poor, marginalized, and without resources. The second follow-on advocacy opportunity that Alex and I are directly involved in is a friend of the court brief before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And you can see our note contributing, we hope, to both international and domestic precedent. El Salvador is a signatory and a member state of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and judgments from that court are binding on El Salvador and its system of laws. So I want to speak a moment about this particular case because, as I mentioned before, sometimes it can be challenging in international human rights advocacy to feel like you have a client-centered or a human-centered approach. But it's our work on the case that's pending before the court that has brought home these cases on a more individual or human level to me. So the case that's pending before the court is one that's actually extensively cited in our trial watch reports, which I believe that IGH is going to circulate to those in attendance today after this, if people want to read in more detail about our analysis. But it's called In the Matter of Manuela. So Manuela, like Evelyn and Diana, was a young, indigent Salvadoran woman. Unlike Evelyn and Diana, the charges against her were not dismissed at the pretrial stage. She went to trial. She was convicted. She lost her appeal, and she was sentenced to 30 years in prison. At that point, the international community became aware of the case. The Center for Reproductive Rights agreed to take the case and represent her in advocacy, first before the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights and then before the Inter-American Court. But I'm sorry to say that it was too late for Manuela because she died in prison after serving approximately 4 years of her 30-year sentence, and she died of Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so, unlike in the United States, where cases are typically dismissed if the party is deceased, that's not the case in the Inter-American Court. And in this instance, although it's too late for Manuela, I'm glad that we can proceed with the advocacy because it offers an opportunity for law reform and an opportunity to prospectively protect the reproductive freedoms and indeed the liberty of people like Manuela and Evelyn and Diana. Alex, is there anything else you wanted to add about impact?
No, I think you covered it all.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, I'm going to stop for now, and Alex and I are happy to take your questions.
Well, great. Thank you both. What tragic stories. So if you have any questions now, you can put them in the chat and we can take them. Here's a question. Would indigenous peoples be included, identified as vulnerable peoples of the world? And how did these cases, such as Diana and Evelyn and others, go public? How did they come to be internationally known?
Yeah, so yeah, I could
Alex.
answer that. Yeah, so yeah, indigenous groups would be considered a minority group. And the reason why they became international was really thanks to the Clooney Foundation for Justice, because a lot of the reason there are so many cases like these that don't get the necessary media attention, but because they're local monitors on the ground, the aim of Child Watch was to put the spotlight on these kind of cases that, you know, internationally are not really heard of. And so I believe that they became public through the work and the partnership between Child Watch and La Agrupación, which was a civil society organization locally based in El Salvador, working with similar women. And then because they have local monitors, Child Watch was able to elevate this case into like the international fora.
Do you expect to see these policy changes you recommend in El Salvador? I mean, this has been going on for quite a while there. I mean, historically, it's been, I mean, notorious, right? Is there actually going to be some change in the politics? Is there any will for that?
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's the tough question. These, you know, the legislation around reproductive rights in El Salvador and throughout other countries in Latin America as well, gathered steam in the late 1980s. The international criticism of the laws, both from a human rights perspective and from a health perspective, has been intense. I remember a talk that I did with Shannon Galvin of the Center for Global Health several years ago, talking about the Zika virus and reproductive right implications for Zika, particularly in countries in Latin America where abortion is prohibited, like in El Salvador, notwithstanding severe health risks that have been already identified to the fetus, such as can be the case in Zika. That particular question was actually pending before the Supreme Court of Brazil, and they dodged it. Zika died away. Well, obviously it still exists, but the prevalence died down, and they avoided the question. So, you know, the question is a tricky one, Rob, because the question is, what is the magic bullet of pressure, international advocacy, and you're absolutely correct, local political will? You know, at the end of the day, I don't think that meaningful change is going to happen, particularly in terms of the deeper attitudes towards women and reproductive health, until there is a change in local political will and culture. Some of the statistics we didn't share but are in the report also relate to an extremely high incidence of both domestic violence and broader sexual violence against women in El Salvador. It's certainly not limited to childbirth and abortion.
Did you get any kind of official opinion or comment from the Ministry of Health in El Salvador from the work you're doing, especially specifically for these cases?
So I don't think, yeah, we didn't get an official, like the Ministry of Health didn't really comment on our reports or findings. But I know that we did get the statistics that we shared regarding suicide and I believe the impact of the criminalization of the abortion ban. Those statistics were from the Ministry of Health in El Salvador.
Yeah. And in both instances, and also in the Manuela case, the healthcare professionals involved were interviewed and testified as witnesses. So you can see that there's an internal paradox within the Ministry of Health, because the Ministry of Health knows full well how bad this policy and these laws are for women's reproductive health. And yet, because of the criminal law framework, they have Ministry of Health employees, healthcare providers, who are reporting witnesses in order to avoid prosecution themselves, and in that sense, indirectly contributing to these reproductive health dangers.
So when those healthcare professionals, when they testified, did they, at the trial, sort of what side did they take? Were they, just trying to cover their own butts in the case, or were they actually trying to help the defendants?
Well, Alex, I'd be interested in your perception. My perception is it's a mix, Rob. I think some of the analyses by the range of healthcare professionals involved in the cases were factual and straightforward. For example, there was a gynecological examination done of Diana that was considered to be a forensic examination in furtherance of the criminal investigation after she had given birth, and she had actually had to, in the hospital, she had to undergo a procedure to remove portions of the placenta that were still inside her. That gynecological examination from a forensic perspective or a weight of the evidence perspective was totally inconclusive. It only stated, this is a woman who's recently given birth, and it's obviously not moving the needle as to whether or not she has committed an act of aggravated homicide. With regard to Manuela, we know for a fact that it was the doctor from whom she sought treatment who reported her to the police. Alex, what's your sense?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I would say it's a mix as well. I know in Evelyn's case, because when she gave birth, she was unconscious because she underwent shock. I believe they did a forensic report of the fetus that was born, and then in that report, it showed that the fetus had died of asphyxia. I think it was asphyxiation, so he wouldn't have been able to survive anyways, and Evelyn wouldn't have been able to save his life because she was also unconscious at the time of birth. So those kind of, I guess in some cases, the doctors were just providing factual evidence. At times they were inconclusive, and at times, they had to, because there's an incentive to report these women, and they also don't want to lose their medical licenses. They have to it's like a delicate balance, I guess, and a delicate line to walk when testifying in court.
Another question from the audience. Could you talk a little bit more about the overall burden of this problem in El Salvador or other countries in the region? For instance, how many cases like this occur every year? How many get to trial watch, attention, and press coverage? And what if they don't get the attention there? What happens to them?
So I'm just looking through the stats I have. Because I know that the Center for Reproductive Rights has taken on a lot of these cases. And I know for sure it's over a dozen of women. Just trying to see if there's so actually I have, the Center for Reproductive Rights has analyzed 129 prosecution cases and found that the majority of these women were young, unmarried, and had lower socioeconomic status. So, and I think this was within, I think, a period of 10 years, I believe. But obviously, you know, if these cases don't get press coverage and these women are not appointed with an attorney or a lawyer, then, you know, unfortunately, I think that the outcome is going to be a negative one.
Yeah, I'll add a bit to that. You know, first, with regard to how many go to Trial Watch, you know, the answer is very, very few.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because the Trial Watch approach is to take a charged case and then do quite a resource-intensive analysis. Trial Watch's goal, of course, is strategic. It's strategically identifying and selecting cases that it wants to make an example of, with the goal of broader impact and reform. But I want to also back up and answer the person's question about prevalence in El Salvador. So despite the abortion ban in El Salvador, and just so you know, these figures come from an excellent article in the Health and Human Rights Journal about human rights law and abortion in El Salvador. So despite the ban, it's estimated that approximately 19,000 abortions took place between 2005 and 2008. However, as we know, you know, that number is likely significantly less than the number of actual abortions, as many of them are clandestine and unreported. It appears that the occurrence in El Salvador and of abortions and the demand for abortions is directly related to the unmet demand for family planning, which we actually haven't discussed in this talk and didn't go into in our analysis of these two cases, but access to family planning is extremely limited in El Salvador. And in one survey, which was limited in El Salvador because it was limited to married women only, it was found that there was a significant gap of knowledge about family planning methods, and also inadequate access and affordability of contraceptive methods. In general, in El Salvador, there is a national family planning program, but it's expensive, it's difficult to obtain, and it's certainly used less frequently in rural areas. There are also cultural influences that have been identified as barriers to family planning within the country.
So is that really sort of part of the whole Catholic Church involvement in the country itself? I mean, are they the ones that are blocking the family planning access to these people?
So the cultural influences have included the Catholic Church and a culture of machismo that have resulted in perceptions of women, of the conduct that women should engage in, of what it means to be feminine, what it means to desire to have a child. So yes, all of those contribute.
So I mean, I noticed that all the three cases you stated, none of these women none of them were married.
No, actually, that's not correct, Rob. I could have been clearer about that. Okay. Diana was married. It appeared that she had a troubled and contentious relationship with her husband. Evelyn was not married. She testified in her trial that she believed that she had become pregnant by a sexual assault. And I'm not sure about Manuela. Mm-hmm. Alex.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. We haven't really fully dived deep into those facts yet, but I'm not entirely sure. But just to add, regarding the context and the background, the total abortion ban was added in 1998 under El Salvador's Penal Code, and that was due to the success of religious and conservative influences that eliminated all the exceptions under which abortion had previously been allowed.
Hmm. There's another question from the audience. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the incentives for the healthcare workers who are reporting these cases? Is it just fear of being implicated in it? I mean, who's going to turn them in, or is there some other incentive involved? I think that's what the question is getting at.
Yeah, so there was a report that the Center for Reproductive Rights had drafted, and it said that they had interviewed healthcare professionals, and it had said that a lot of them felt that they were legally obligated to report their patients to the police in order to avoid criminal prosecution. So in order not to lose their license. That's mostly the incentive, because they feel obligated towards the government to comply. If not, they're going to lose their medical licenses.
And who would be reporting them? Just other healthcare workers, or?
Yeah, I think your question is excellent, Rob. It goes to how the criminal legislation is actually enforced on the ground. And the truth is, I don't know. I don't know if there are regular audits of healthcare workers by law enforcement or by the prosecutor's office, or if it's simply a culture of distrust and fear, which has long been fostered because of this legal regime. I thought the question was going to go in a slightly different direction and ask about privilege and doctor-patient privilege. It's El Salvador's position, in case you're curious, that a doctor-patient privilege does not apply in an instance where there's a criminal act taking place. Now, that is actually a position that's consistent with professional responsibility rules around privilege in the United States, and I'll flip its head and give one quick example. There's the so-called crime fraud exception to attorney-client privilege. An attorney's advice to that person's client is not privileged if what the attorney's doing is actually furthering that client's criminal activity. So you can see that's directly analogous to the position that El Salvador is taking. The issue, of course, is that the underlying criminalized conduct in these cases is itself spurious and a human rights violation.
Another question here, is there, besides the legal advocacy, is there any other support for these women, including, is there mental health support or to go along with all this?
Yeah, Alex, do you want to speak to that? We were talking about it a bit.
Yeah, so I mean, Trial Watch doesn't really work on providing healthcare services or kind of psychological support, but I believe L'Agrupation, I think, might be providing some of those services, but obviously there are huge gaps in those services. There's also a stigma towards mental health generally in Latin America and specifically in El Salvador. So obviously there are going to be tremendous gaps, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah, and the Center for Reproductive Rights has also done an extensive analysis of the extent to which both the abortion ban and restrictions around reproductive choice and also a lack of access to family planning can generate or aggravate stress and implicate mental well-being.
Right. We're approaching the end of the hour. I don't see any other questions in here. So I want to thank you both, Juliet Sorensen and Alexandra, for taking the time to share your work with us today. You have us all thinking a lot. It's incredible, the project and the work that you're doing. Thank you very much. I want to thank also the audience for joining us today and for submitting your questions. And we hope you will join us for the first Friday webinar in October. More details will be coming up shortly to tell you what the topic that we're selecting. And for those that have registered, there is a recording of this webinar, and subject materials provided by today's speakers will be shared via email shortly. And so that formally concludes today's webinar. Thank you again, Juliet and Alex, for your very insightful presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob, and thanks to the Institute for Global Health.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.